Everyone. The League of Women Voters of Saratoga County meetup on plastic. Fantastic. A look at the growing environmental problem. I'm Sherry Gray, and Lori Dawson and I are the co-chairs of the meetups. And although Lori is not here in person, she is here in spirit. If everyone could please mute their microphones, we would really appreciate that during the presentation, and particularly right now because we're getting a lot of interference. Meetups are a way for us to come together virtually to explore, understand, and advocate for issues that matter to us. They are focused on our members and their interests. We are open to all, so invite a friend to register for upcoming meetups. Most often they are held on the third Wednesdays of the month. If you or someone you know wants to become a member, you will find membership information on our website by clicking the red join button. And that is Saratoga, lwvsaratoga.org. I would like to remind you of our upcoming league events, which can also be found on our website, lwvsaratoga.org. On Monday, May 16th, from 7 to 8:30, we'll have the concurrence meeting on 4 league positions on waste. I think that was just being discussed as everyone was logging into the meetup tonight. On Wednesday, May 18th, from 7 to 8:30, we'll have a meetup on looking for your ideas on both events and meetups for next year. That is the end of fall 2022 into June of 2023. On Wednesday, June 15th, we have at the Spa Park, the Columbia Pavilion from 5 to 8 p.m. will be our 56th annual meeting. Now, I got those times and dates, and I don't know if I'm absolutely correct about that, but just keep an eye on the website for our annual meeting. Please mute your mics on our computer and feel free to use the chat function for any questions or comments you have. You can also use the raise hand function to ask a question. I would like to thank our Environmental Committee Chair, Joanna Lasher, Lenore Reber, and Mary Alice Nyan. And also thank our co-sponsor, Sustainable Saratoga. Wendy Mahoney, Executive Director of Sustainable Saratoga, would like to say a few words regarding their organization. So Wendy, take it away.
All right, thanks, Sherry. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Saratoga County for inviting us to co-sponsor this evening's discussion. Thank you, everybody tuning in from home to learn more about this important topic. As Sherry said, I'm the Executive Director of Sustainable Saratoga. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Sustainable Saratoga is a local not-for-profit organization that focuses on the protection of our natural resources and promoting sustainability for the benefit of current and future generations. Our focus areas include land use and natural resource protection, addressing the climate crisis, expanding the urban forest, creating habitat and food sources for pollinator protection, and reducing how much stuff, food, clothing, electronics, energy, water, the list goes on, we consume and waste in our daily lives. We have a number of events happening this month for Earth Month, including composting workshops, tree toga, and an upcoming talk about the importance of native plants for pollinators. We're excited to co-sponsor this evening's talk on plastic pollution. If you get inspired by tonight's talk, you can sign up for our litter cleanup event happening on Saturday. There are links to all of our upcoming events on our webpage and also our Facebook events page. There's no shortage of work to be done, and providing educational events like this evening's discussion is an essential part of our mission to make a tangible difference in our community. Thank you again for signing up, and I'll turn it over to introduce tonight's speaker.
Sorry, did you say you're turning it over to me?
I was trying to get myself unmuted.
Oh, no.
Okay, I think I'm next. I'm Joanna Lasher. I'm chair of environment for Saratoga League. And I want to welcome everybody here. I'm glad you came. Anne Ernst is our speaker tonight. She is a senior lecturer in the Environmental Studies and Sciences program at Skidmore College. She teaches both a science course and a first-year seminar in plastics, as well as several introductory ESS courses. Prior to Skidmore, she worked as a research biologist at the US Geological Survey. She's also a member of Sustainable Saratoga. Many of you will remember her from last year's environmental program when she recruited and moderated a panel of young environmental activists, as well as acting as the moderator for Paul Tonko, who came on that program also. So I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So Anne, take it away.
All right, well, thanks very much to the League of Women Voters and everyone here for coming to the talk tonight. I can't talk and do things at the same time, so I'm just getting ready to share my screen, but I should have had this ready, but I did not. Okay, so I, like Joe said, I teach a couple classes. I teach a number of classes for the Environmental Studies and Sciences program. And, about 3 years ago, it was spring of 2019, I, for the first time, I taught a class on plastics. Can everyone see the screen? Can everyone see it says Plastic Fantastic? Okay, so and I had this idea of developing a new class on plastics because it's in the news all the time. You hear all the stuff about the plastics and problems with pollution and problems with chemicals leaching from them and with recycling. And so you probably been reading all the same stories that inspired me to develop this class, right? So this is just a few plastic shock facts, right? We produce a lot of plastic. About 8.3 billion tons of plastic have been produced globally, and our rate of production keeps increasing. We are terrible at recycling it. You've probably heard this number too, that we recycle less than 10% of plastics, of all the plastics that have been produced. And as a result of this, a lot of plastic, it ends up entering the environment. So it's in the air and it's on the ground. But what we hear about most is plastic in our ocean, because that's often its final destination. This number, I'm going to talk about this later tonight, about 8 million metric tons of plastic entering the oceans every year. And that number, again, is increasing. And what we keep contributing to this, right? So plastic bags and plastic water bottles, single-use plastic water bottles, are very emblematic of our tremendous reliance on disposable plastic products, right? So I'm going to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes giving you an overview of plastics and some of the problems that it has caused. But first, I've got a quick assignment for you. And if I recognize some names. I know some of you have seen this talk already. I've talked about plastics at Science on Tap, and I've talked about plastics for the Encore program at Skidmore. So bear with me, but I want you to spend the next 30 seconds thinking about everything you've touched since you woke up this morning that is plastic, and kind of get a little mental count. So I'll give you 30 seconds. Go ahead. Thirty seconds seems really long on Zoom. I will say it seems a lot shorter when I'm actually in person and I can see people. So I probably gave you 15 seconds, but I do this in my intro. I do this in my intro environmental issues course that I teach. And I teach this class one section at 8:40 in the morning, and my students aren't even awake. And they barely rolled out of bed, and they still have like 25 things on their list. So I'm guessing you guys have a pretty high number. given that it's the evening, and you probably came up with a lot of standard things like the light switch or the toilet seat or your toothbrush, or if you drove somewhere today, the car door. But probably some of you didn't think to, for instance, write clothes on your list, right? So most of our clothes, unless you're wearing straight cotton or wool or linen, you're probably wearing plastic. If it stretches, it's probably plastic. If you're sitting at a table and it's wood and you're like, oh, well, I'm touching wood, that's a natural product, but you're probably not actually touching the wood, you're touching the polyurethane coating that went on top of the wood. So that's plastic. If it has the word poly in it, it's probably plastic. And so you're probably thinking, okay, well, wait, what? Like, my underwear is plastic? What exactly is a plastic? So let's just spend a very short time talking about what plastics are, right? So a polymer is a chemical compound where there are molecules in long repeating chains. So mono means one, right? Mer just means part. So a monomer is just one part. And when you put together a whole chain of those parts, you get a polymer. So there's a lot of natural polymers like DNA, or really any protein is a polymer, cellulose, silk, right? A lot of polymers are produced naturally and they're biologically compatible, which means your body can break them back down, or nature can break them back down into their atomic structure. But plastics are different, right? So plastics are a semi-organic material made up of these polymers. But they're formed artificially and they're really chemically stable. And because of that, they don't easily break back down to their atomic structure. So we'll say like plastics break up into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic, but they don't break down. That was a really good thing for a long time. When plastics first came out, plastics were hailed as an ecological savior. Plastics came out, and therefore, instead of having to have real tortoise shell for combs and things, you could make a synthetic replicate out of plastic. And so plastic was supposed to really save our natural environment, right? And we could have a substitute for ivory, and we could have a substitute for tortoise shell, and we could have a substitute for coral, because we could make an artificial replica out of plastic, and that was going to be a really good thing. And instead, what we found was that plastics kind of took over during the war. Is really when plastics kind of proliferated. They were originally during World War II, we needed rubber for aviator goggles, and we needed silk for parachutes. And we came up with synthetic replicas for this. We could make all of that out of plastic. And so everyone during World War II was used to going without, giving up for the troops. And then the war ended and everyone was like, woohoo, like we don't have to do that anymore. And so this was the cover of Life magazine in 1952. Post World War II, there was throwaway living, that it was celebrated that we could finally not have to go without, because we had everything we needed, and we could make it all through the wonder of chemistry, right? And making it all through plastic. And this in many ways is still can be a good thing. We have to keep in mind that like we're going to talk a lot. I'm going to talk a lot about the environmental problems that have resulted from our reliance on plastic, single-use plastics. But plastics can provide a huge benefit to the environment in many ways. They're a critical component of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power. They're very useful in making transportation more fuel efficient, not just electric cars like I have in this image here, but cars in general, and really all transportation. Things are lighter when you can make plastic parts rather than parts out of metal, which means they use less fuel to move. Food storage has been another thing, right? There's certainly an excess use in food packaging, but plastic can also help prolong the shelf life of food products. Food waste is the third largest producer of greenhouse gases on a global scale. And so helping food last longer by protecting it with plastic is one way that we can help it reduce greenhouse gases and address climate change. So there are some really good things about plastic in terms of, to say nothing about the benefits of plastics in terms of advances in medicine, in safety and construction. So there are very good plastic, but still they cause a lot of problems. And so here's an illustration that sort of underscores some of those problems. We're producing more and more of it. In 1950, again, that was like the post-World War II boom of plastic production. In 1950, we produced 2 million metric tons. By 2017, it was 8.3 billion, and the projection is a fourfold increase by 2050. Which is tremendously high. Only 9% of plastics has been recycled, which is pretty pathetic. The rest gets burned. You'll often hear that referred to as waste to energy, but it's incinerating the plastics. Or it gets landfilled, or it ends up out in the environment. So let's start on this 9%. Let's just focus a little bit on why do only 9% of our plastics get recycled? If you're like me, you might think that's pretty pathetic, especially in the United States, where we have wealth and infrastructure. We should be able to do a better job. So why? Well, one big reason is because recycling is confusing. So you are probably familiar with these recycling codes on the bottom of various plastic materials, the chasing arrows. But despite that appearance, it does not mean that plastic is going to be recycled. It just indicates what kind of resin the material is made from. Different areas accept different plastic resins, depending on where you live. Some places only take 1 and 2. Some places take 1 through 5. Some take all of them. There isn't really much of a market for any plastic resin aside from 1 and 2. And this image is actually pretty misleading, because if you look over here on number 7, other is a pretty wide range of different plastic resins. And in fact, there are at least 267 different plastic types, different types of plastic polymers. When their different resins are mixed together, it can affect material properties and cause defects in the manufacturing process. You need advanced processing facilities to create really high quality stock, and those are expensive. So that's one big reason. A lot of these reductions in what resin types are accepted by recycling have come from just in the past couple of years. They've been driven by China's national sword policy. You may know this, we used to sell all of our waste to China. And then in January of 2018, they implemented their national sword policy, which said no more plastic imports, severe restrictions on imports by they reduced the acceptable level of contamination. The US and many other industrialized countries had been selling their plastic waste to China for so long that we never bothered to develop our own recycling infrastructure domestically. And you might be thinking, if you didn't know we sold our waste to China, well, why? Like, why does that seem like a good idea to take all of our waste and send it halfway around the world? One is because China really did have low contamination standards for the imports. And so when we went in the United States from, if you remember, you used to have to separate your recycling into the newspapers and the glass and the aluminum. And then all of a sudden it was single stream, which meant contamination was much, much higher, but China would take that. Also, their environmental regulations are super low. And so again, it was just easier to send it there and process it there than in a country where the regulations are the standards are higher. China is the world's most populous country. And so they've got a lot of cheap labor. And so that was one more thing fueling this. And they needed the raw material to create new products, right? If you have 1.4 billion people in your country, there's only so much raw material that you can provide internally. And so they would import the waste and use that as raw material to create new products and then send that all over the world. And there were a lot of trade imbalances because we import so much from China. You can imagine you've got these giant cargo ships that would ship stuff from China. Everything says made in China, right? Everything would come in these cargo ships. And then if we didn't fill it up with something, those cargo ships would have to go back empty. And so it was really cheap to fill them up with our waste and send it over to China where they would buy it from us. So all of these different things created a setting where it made sense, is kind of a strong word, but it made sense to send our waste to China, at least economically. But China got tired of taking it. There was a movie called Plastic China that came out. The Chinese government scrubbed it pretty quickly from the internet, but enough people saw it that they really started pushing the government to start having standards. And so that's what happened in 2018. Oh, and then, sorry, I was going to summarize what I was going to tell you. All right, so the third thing is that without a big change in legislation, at least in the United States, it is unlikely the US is ever going to develop the infrastructure to deal with its own plastic waste because virgin materials are so much cheaper than recycled. This picture, maybe some of you know what it is. If you don't, this is an ethane cracker plant, which provides the base materials to make new plastics. We have a glut of cheap oil and natural gas in the United States, and the world is moving toward renewable energy. So what on earth are gas and oil companies going to do with their product, right? Oh, they could turn it into plastic. This particular cracker plant that I have the image of up here is the largest one in the world. It's located on the Gulf Coast in Texas. Since 2019, at least 42 new plastics facilities have opened or are under construction or are in the permitting process. The plastics industry is expected to contribute more to global climate change than coal by 2030. And this is a result of two factors, right? One is that there are declining trends in coal on a global scale, but also this is a huge expansion in plastics production. And this is just this is just a map of where these cracker plants are located, right? And so you can see a lot of them are down in Texas. They're in Pennsylvania near the Marcellus Shale, or they're in North Dakota near the Bakken Shale, right? So we have a lot. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas in the United States. And so we're going to put that to use. If people are moving away from fossil fuels, then that gas is more likely to get turned into plastics. And this is just a quick graph to show this was global plastic consumption in 2014, so 8 years ago, that you can see how much of different types of plastic resins are coming from recycled material versus virgin materials. And it's overwhelmingly produced by using virgin materials. So new, like by drilling for oil or fracking for gas, that we're not using the recycled material to form new plastics. All right, there's a fourth reason that we don't recycle much, or that recycling hasn't done so well. On a global scale, there are a lot of other complicated reasons why recycling rates are low. In developing countries, 80 to 90% of recycling is done by the informal economy, which essentially are waste pickers. Municipal budgets in a lot of developing countries can't afford to provide formal recycling infrastructure. And volatility in the commodities market affects all levels of recycling, but because waste pickers are providing so much of that recycled plastic, they can have an outsized effect. So for instance, when oil prices fell during the shutdown during COVID, the demand for recycled plastics plummeted because virgin plastics were so cheap. And when the waste pickers stopped feeding plastic into the supply chain, because there's such a big contributor at the base of the food chain, essentially, the whole system suffers. And ultimately, recycling is not really a solution, right? We don't actually tend to recycle, we tend to downcycle. If we take a single-use water bottle and we turn it into a fleece, or we turn it into a park bench, that doesn't reduce the demand for plastic that's going into a new water bottle. So until we can figure out a way to turn a plastic water bottle into a new plastic water bottle, we're not reducing the demand for new plastics. People like to recycle because it feels like a solution to waste, but without actual market for recycled plastic, nothing's actually being recycled, right? So municipalities have to pay to sort everything. So that this picture on the lower right here is sorted bales, like clean sorted bales of plastic by resin type. But if there's nowhere for it to go, then there's nowhere for it to go. And now that China doesn't want it, it's harder to find places who will take it. All right, so let's focus on the 79% of the plastics that aren't recycled and aren't burned. Some make it to a landfill. That is much more common in the United States or in other industrialized countries that have that waste management infrastructure in place. But a lot of it ends up in the environment. It ends up in the air, it ends up on our soils, it ends up in our food. But the main place you hear about it is in our oceans. Right? So this is just a figure showing ocean currents around the globe because of the rotation of the Earth and where land masses are located and wind patterns. Ocean currents in the northern hemisphere tend to move in these clockwise motion, and in the southern hemisphere it's counterclockwise motion, and they form. There are 5 gyres across the world, and because of the way the ocean current is moving around and around, it tends to gather anything that's floating on the surface in the center, and so that's a lot of plastic. So you can see by the color, right, the darker the from yellow to orange, the darker the color, the more intense the concentration of microplastics in that area. So you can see that they tend to gather in these gyres. And the one you've probably heard about the most is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is the North Pacific Gyre, but there are 5 around the world. So the most thorough estimate of how much plastic is entering the ocean every year came out in 2015 from Jenna Jambeck and some of her colleagues at the University of Georgia. The number you hear everywhere is 8 million metric tons. This is the number I gave you in the beginning in the shop facts. This is the number you hear in news stories and articles. This is based on their estimate of somewhere between 4.7 and 12.8 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean every year. And on average, it's 8. So that's the number everyone uses because it's an easy summary. What Dr. Jambeck and her colleagues did is they looked at, there are 192 countries in the world that have coastline. They looked at all 192 countries. They analyzed the waste per capita in each of those countries. They determined what fraction of that waste tends to be plastic. And then they determined how much of that waste is mismanaged, and then used that to model this number. This could easily be an underestimate. It doesn't include ocean-based inputs like abandoned fishing gear, oil platforms. It doesn't include anything from landlocked countries that would have rivers that could easily carry plastic into the ocean, but it's our best current estimate. And one thing you'll notice if you look at this picture is that a lot of the plastic is recognizable, right? You can see a bag, can, some wrappers. This is what we call macro plastic. It can cause a host of problems. The bags in particular are really bad for entanglement because of the handles. Next to fishing gear, next to abandoned fishing gear, plastic bags have the highest rate for entanglement of wildlife. And balloons are also pretty bad because of the long string that is generally tied to every balloon. But most ocean plastic doesn't look like this, right? Macroplastics in the oceans break up into smaller and smaller pieces for a number of reasons, right? Wave action, UV radiation can break up the plastic. So often the water just looks cloudy, right? But if you look closely, you can see these tiny little pieces of plastic floating in the water, and on the shoreline, you can see a lot of those plastics more clearly. So microplastics are any plastics that are 5 millimeters or smaller. Microplastics cause a problem for a different set of reasons. They are not going to entangle anything, but they can get eaten. And this is a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, some of them are really sharp pieces, and they can pierce the GI tract of an animal and cause infection. The plastic can fill the stomach and make it hard for that animal to get enough actual food because the plastic won't be digested. So it keeps filling up their stomach. There's less and less room for food. And so animals will starve to death if they've eaten too much plastic. And then there's a risk of contamination that's associated with the plastics. And I'm going to get back to that in just a second. But I did want to point out that in this picture that I'm showing, these are what we call secondary microplastics, which means they're formed from big plastics that are breaking down into small plastics. But you can also have plastics that are formed as microplastics, and those are called primary microplastics, right? And there's a number of sources for those, but the main ones, the main one really are microfibers. So these are plastic fibers that are shed from wear and tear, like clothes or tires, but clothes, right? So again, think back to when I had you thinking about everything you touch that's plastic. Our clothes are largely made out of plastic. One cycle of a washing machine can produce about 700,000 microfibers. And that's every load from a washing machine. And then that all goes to a wastewater treatment plant. And wastewater treatment plants are remarkably effective at filtering that out because they're small, but they're long, right? So you can imagine, like there's a picture, that's what's shown in the back of this, on the background image on this slide are the microfibers. And wastewater treatment plants will filter those out up to 90%, but that means 10% is still getting through, and 10% of a really big number is still a really big number of microfibers that are getting out into the environment. And on top of that, not all wastewater treatment plants, but many wastewater treatment plants take the stuff that they've filtered out, which tends to be really high in nitrogen and phosphorus, and then they use it as agricultural fertilizer. So it just goes right back out into the environment and gets spread on fields, and then the plastic's back out in the environment along with that. And so there was a study done by Mark Brown and some of his colleagues in 2016 that found 85% of shoreline pollution tends to be these microfibers. Okay, so let me then talk about one of the big concerns with plastic, right, is the risk that plastics pose for contamination, right? Because they can be harmful to anything that ingests it. So there's really three main contamination risks. One is additives. So plastics, in addition to the huge array of different resin types that can be used to build plastic, to form plastics, things will be added to those, to that polymer, for instance, to change its color or to make it more resistant to UV radiation, or to increase its flexibility, right? So if you think about PVC, polyvinyl chloride, you might be thinking of the pipe in your basement that, that's used for plumbing, hard as a rock, those big white PVC pipes. But that's PVC, but so is PVC that is so flexible that you can use it as an IV tube in the NICU, right? So you can take that same material by adding enough stuff to it and make it really flexible. So there are a lot of additives, but one class of additives that is the most dangerous or potential for risk are phthalates. It's a class of chemicals that are shown here. The R in this picture just means the rest of the molecules. So there are a lot of different phthalates. And they all have the same chemical structure that's shown to the left of the R's. And phthalates are plasticizers, which means they make plastic softer. They make it more bendy. And they're small relative to the size of a polymer, right? Polymers can be thousands of thousands of like carbon molecules long. And so the phthalates are small relative to that, so they can easily move out of that polymer matrix. And phthalates are, they act as endocrine disruptors. They can cause developmental problems. Another risk for contamination are the monomers themselves. So the way polymers form is you take a whole bunch of monomers and you put them in a contained environment where they get polymerized or formed into these long chains, but not all of them, most of them, but not all of them end up in this long polymer chain, and some of the monomers get left behind. And so some of the most concerning ones are BPA or bisphenol A, which is shown here, and styrene. So BPA is one of the monomers that's used to form polycarbonate, which is a really hard, clear plastic, like plexiglass. It's also used for baby bottles, or it was used for baby bottles until fairly recently. Bisphenol A was actually originally developed to be an estrogen substitute, so it acts like an estrogen. And then styrene, if you take a lot of styrene monomers and you put them all together, you get polystyrene, which is the base of, for instance, styrofoam. But styrene on its own is a carcinogen. It can cause it has a big host of human health problems that are associated with it. And so again, these guys are really tiny compared to the size of a polymer, which means they can migrate out of a polymer matrix pretty easily. And then that can cause human health problems. And then finally, the third big risk is coming from toxins that are absorbed from the environment. So microplastics in the environment tend to have really high surface area per volume, partly because of how they form. The more degraded the plastic, the more surface area it tends to have, and that allows for a lot of absorption of these toxins. And a lot of these are in the environment, especially in the ocean or in rivers. And plastics help concentrate them. They float around. These toxins like to stick to the plastic. And then as the plastic moves, it can concentrate some of these toxins that would otherwise be fairly dispersed in the environment. And some of the more concerning ones are PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. The culprit in the Hudson River cleanup, right? The largest Superfund cleanup in the history of Superfund. The molecule in the middle is polybrominated diphenyl esters. That's like a typical flame retardant. So flame retardants are added to a lot of things, right? Particularly our clothes and our blankets. But they can migrate out and they end up in the environment. And then PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are formed as a byproduct with fossil fuels. All of these toxins have negative health consequences, and then they get concentrated when they're in the environment. They can get concentrated on these plastics. And the concern really is, all right, well, what about me, right? Like it's really bad in the environment, but also it's not great for me potentially, right? So bioaccumulation is when the toxins are stored in the tissues rather than being metabolized or expelled. And so one organism, say a zooplankton floating in the ocean, as it's exposed, as it's eating, say, phytoplankton that are exposed to this, it can't expel the toxins, and so it's going to accumulate in that one zooplankton over time. Biomagnification is when these toxins increase in concentration per unit biomass at higher trophic levels. And who's at the top of the food chain? Well, we are, right? We are eating some of these fish. And the risk is, that we might have this higher exposure to some of these toxins because of a number of reasons, but partly because of the ability of plastics to concentrate them and then be part of that food chain. We don't know the consequence of the exposure to these chemicals. Determining cause and effect is very slow, and the research into this is still quite young. So there's a concern, certainly, but we haven't yet, for a lot of these, don't have a lot of definitive answers on what some of the effects of this will be. How much of a risk is this to people? Another thing to think about too is that aside from the effects of the toxins that are associated with the plastics, there's also a real concern about the effects of the plastics themselves. For example, microplastics can break into nanoplastics, which just means they're breaking up into even smaller pieces, right? These are really hard to detect. We don't have a lot of ability to reliably detect nanoplastics. So we don't really know a lot about this yet. This is a very novel area of research, but there's certainly a risk, right, that if we're exposed to nanoplastics, that this can lead to inflammation, right? This could lead to delivery of other toxins really deep into our tissues because the nanoplastics are so small that they can go farther into tissues. We don't know yet. These are concerns, but they're not something we really have a lot of information about yet. That's all very cheery. So now you might be thinking, okay, can we do anything? And so given all of that, given all the problems with recycling, all the problems with plastics in the environment, all the problems with toxins that are associated with plastics, what can we do? So let's think about what are the problems, right? They don't break down. Some plastics are more toxic than others. They cause a lot of problems in the environment, right? So they don't break down. Well, what if we could figure out a way to break down the polymers, right? So in the upper left, right? What about bioplastics, right? Where you could actually reduce the plastic back to its atomic structure after use. And this is a big area of research. Rather than using fossil fuels, can we use bio-based polymers to build these plastics? We'll see. A lot of these times you're not using fossil fuels as the base material, but once you polymerize it, it's still just as bad as any other plastic. It's still not going to break down. There is also a lot of research into, for instance, different researchers have been identifying bacteria outside of recycling plants and trying to identify bacteria that will break down plastic because that's the food source. And so a lot of bacteria they think might have the potential to evolve to break that down. So that's, again, a new area of research. We'll see. Some plastics are more toxic than others, right? So what if we could come up with an alternative, right? Like, so this upper right, what if there's a company in Green Island, New York, just south of here, called Ecovative that some of you may have heard of. And what they are doing is making a plastic alternative out of mycelium, which is the root structure of mushrooms. And so the idea is, what if we can just grow a substitute? Because then we're not using fossil fuels. So we're not concerned about that. And then after this is used, then it's biologically compatible. So you can put it into your compost pile or throw it in your backyard and it will break down again. So finding less harmful alternatives might be a solution. There's a lot of problems with plastics once they're in the environment, right? With entanglement and with absorbing pollutants. So maybe we clean up the plastic, right? So lower left, right? Some of you guys have heard about maybe the Great Ocean Cleanup. It was launched in September of 2018 by Boyan Slat, who was had this idea that you could launch these floating tubes in the ocean to trap marine plastics by kind of creating artificial shorelines. And then you can collect it and bring it on shore and either dispose of it or recycle it. And they also have expanded to catch river plastics before they reach the ocean. The goal is to clean up 50% of plastics in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the next 5 years. There's some criticism over this, right? People certainly want it to work because it would provide an easy solution that would not make us change the way we use plastics. And it's not actually changing the amount of plastics that are entering the ocean. It's just getting rid of the plastics once they're in the ocean. What if we could figure out a way to stop plastics from getting to the ocean? Well, that's lower right? So there's an organization called the Plastic Bank that was started by two guys from Vancouver, British Columbia. And the idea is that they pay people to collect plastic, and then the people who gather it can sell it. And you use that, they sell it not necessarily for money, but for things like school tuition for their kids or a clean cook stove. And so then they take that plastic that's been gathered and clean it and then sell it as social plastic. It's like fair trade coffee, right? A number of companies have started buying it. Reebok, Adidas, Henkel's. Some of these are some of the companies that are buying this social plastic, and the idea is that they're both stopping the plastic from getting into the ocean and also addressing poverty at the same time. So there are plastic banks in Haiti, in India, in Indonesia, in a number of countries with high rates of poverty. So again, good, right? The plastic isn't getting into the environment, and that certainly is a good solution. But really, if we want to turn off the tap for real, we have to stop producing so much plastic, right? And the only way to do that is to vote. As an invited guest of the League of Women Voters, I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But the plastic pollution issue is really it's often presented as a consumer problem, right? We aren't recycling. We're mismanaging our waste. Governments aren't investing enough money in infrastructure. And if we could figure out a solution to these problems, if we changed our behavior, then maybe we could figure out an answer. But the people who are profiting from this, right? The companies that are profiting from this constant manufacturing and increasing manufacturing of plastic aren't being asked to change anything, right? So ultimately, a real solution to managing this problem is to just stop producing so much plastic. So there's a little pitch for, there's a group Beyond Plastics that is a really good starting point for ways to get involved. If you go to their website, there's a lot of good information on upcoming legislation, individual actions that you can take, right? One big piece of legislation that's being promoted right now is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2021. It's currently being sponsored by Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon. The idea, here's sort of a summary of what the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act will accomplish, but in short, the real summary is it shifts responsibility from the consumers to the manufacturers and the producers. It phases out certain single-use plastics that aren't recyclable. It prohibits plastic waste from being exported to developing countries, because the dirty secret behind us not sending our waste to China anymore is we're just sending it to other countries right now who don't have the same regulations. And so this would prohibit plastic waste from going to developing countries. And then a big thing is that it places a moratorium on new and expanding plastic facilities. So it forces us as the United States to manage our own waste, and then it stops the production of new plastic production facilities to hopefully, again, turn off that tap. There are smaller bills that are being considered that you can also support, you can look into. One right now is HR 5533, which would eliminate the sale of single-use plastics in national parks. This was attempted in 2011 by Obama. It was a voluntary ban, and it was overturned by Trump as soon as he came to office. Early in 2017, Trump overturned this. In that window, it wasn't a law. It was voluntary, and in that time, there was a huge decrease in plastic waste with national parks. So this could be a really important way of addressing part of the problem, right? And in general, just call your legislators, right? Your senator, your representative, your mayor, whoever can help enact legislation that is going to address some of these concerns. You don't need an official bill to support, although you certainly call them and tell them that you want to support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, or that you want to support HR 5533 or any other legislation you want to see promoted. But you can also urge the White House Council on Environmental Quality or the EPA or the Army Corps of Engineers to reject permits for new or expanded petrochemical facilities, right? You can push local municipalities to ban some of the most common sources of single-use plastic pollution, including plastic bags, straws, styrofoam, balloon releases, right? Ultimately, we need to have a variety of innovative solutions at every level in order to address the problems associated with plastics and help create a cleaner, more just society, right? And with that, I will stop sharing. I am happy to take questions. You can either raise your hand, or I'll look in the chat too. Why is it described as a cracker plant? It's something to do with the process of turning those molecules. It's called cracking, and I probably, oh, someone else answered. All right. Where's a question that hasn't been answered? Let me see. Given the magnitude of problems with plastics, what's the best idea at the present to reduce the size of the problem? Gosh, isn't that a good question? It's one of those wicked problems, right? Where there's not some easy solution. I think a lot of the changing, honestly, I think a lot of top-down changes have to be put in place. Certainly during the Trump administration, we were never going to see a lot of top-down stuff, at least on a federal level. And so sometimes companies will step up. But I think until there's a lot of top-down change in legislation to regulate what we're allowed to produce, that I think that's really going to be a big part of the solution. Anyone else?
Hi, Anne, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Like a lot of people are hesitating. I think it's just such a huge problem, so out of our hands. I can't buy a product without it being wrapped in plastic, even if it's a wood product. And it's kind of overwhelming to try to think about, even if you do things on your own basis. It's just a bigger problem than any of us can comprehend. I don't really know if I have a question here or just, it's very frustrating. And to me, I've been very aware of this for a long time and have been avoiding taking plastic bags for many, many years. But, how can we really do anything? It's hard. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I think because then it's our problem, right? Because you buy that product and now you've got the waste. You bought the thing. Like, are you going to dispose of it properly? This is all on you. But if the manufacturers had to actually deal with that waste, there'd be a better solution, right? They'd either figure out a way that if they had to take it back, there would be a better solution. There just isn't right now. Like, they don't have to do that. I mean, that whole thing with the plastic resin numbers, that's a total greenwash campaign, because there was this big fear among plastic producers and bottling companies that everything was glass, right? And everyone took the back, you'd get your bottle of soda, and then when you drank it, you'd return the glass bottle and you'd get a refill. And no one wanted to do that with plastic. And so they thought, oh, well, what if we put a number on it? Then we don't have to take it back because they'll take care of it. We'll just make them think that this is getting recycled. And so it became the consumer's problem instead of the manufacturer's problem. So if we can change that, if we can put the responsibility back on the manufacturer, I think that could go a long way toward helping to address the problem. Monica, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I mean, I really did think my biggest problem with plastic recycling was washing my peanut butter jar enough that I could put it in the recycling bin. But it sounds like the problem is so overwhelming that even if we do reach a point where we have a place to put our recyclables, we have something that keeps it from making it, the plastic bits going into the ocean, we still have to get rid of it. It still has to go somewhere. So it's going into the landfills. Is that really the solution we're looking for?
Right? I mean, we're taking this thing that we're paying like $4 a gallon for and using it once, and then we're just throwing it in the garbage and it's getting landfilled. Like, does that make sense? Not really. Sorry, that's a terribly depressing answer.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't expect much of a better answer. I think in looking at your slides, the food for thought was very filling.
Barb, what's your question? Barb Thomas?
I first wanted to say that I remember back when we were first demonstrating for the bottle bill in New York State. And I remember that Bill Dake, who ran the Stewart's Dairy Product Company in this area, was very enamored of it because he thought, gee, that's a way for his company to save money. They would just they would have a deposit, they would get those bottles back, and they would refill them. But I don't know what happened to change the economics of that situation. I mean, I would say maybe 5 years, they had plastic bottles that you did return to the store.
Right.
I mean, they were thicker, harder sort of plastic than these very light refillable soda bottles, say.
Yeah, I mean, the thing even with that is you there's only so many times you can reuse a plastic bottle, like they'll degrade, right? And then
Yeah.
We had the first time I taught this class, I somehow managed to convince the VP of sustainability of Pepsi to call into my class, which was awesome. She's never it was great. And she called in at the end of the semester. So my students were super well informed. And I think it was not as easy a class to talk to as she thought it might be. And she's never answered another one of my emails. But she talked a lot about how they, especially in country, she said Pepsi takes into consideration what's the waste management infrastructure. And so in a developing country without a lot of that, for instance, they'll make their chip bags out of material. They're moving toward making their chip bags out of material that will biodegrade in the sun because they know it's going to end up in the environment. And so she said they were doing a lot of stuff to try and collect and then reuse these plastic bottles. And then my students were pushing back and saying, wait, but doesn't that mean it's going to leach more chemicals when you wash it and then refill it? And there was not a great response. Like, I don't know how much progress they've actually made on that campaign. And I don't know what Stewart's was doing in terms of, addressing some of those problems when they were taking those back. I don't know enough about that program. Julie.
I was wondering if there are any direct illnesses or bodily problems that have been directly related to a plastic pollution. Anything in particular? Because I mean, there's more pancreatic cancer you hear about, and there are things that are possibly related. Is anything specifically related to plastic?
With people, I haven't been able to find anything that's super definite. They did. I read this study where they had snails that were being raised, some in glass bottles and then some in plastic bottles. And the snails in the plastic bottles had way more eggs. Like there was certainly some kind of hormone activity come out of that plastic, right? So what does that mean for us? I don't know. But like we don't really know yet. I mean, that cause and effect is really hard to show because a lot of the things aren't immediate. Maybe it skips, maybe it's because then your kids have something. Or maybe it's you're exposed when you're younger and then something happens when you're older, and then drawing that connection back to the plastic or to chemicals. And did it come from the plastic or did it come from other environmental exposures? It's just so hard to make those links. So I think there's a lot of anecdotal information, but that's where like there is a lot of research into this now, but it's still pretty new as far as science research goes. Joe.
The Break Free from Plastic Act. I think can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Isn't that an extended producer responsibility type bill or?
That's certainly part of it. And I know that David Sayre is on tonight. And if David wants to jump in and help answer that question, he's more than welcome, because I know David is more familiar with this than I am. He doesn't have to. He's muted.
He's muted.
Yeah,
Hey, folks, yeah.
Oh,
Come off
sorry,
mute
go
just for a sec. Right. So extended producer responsibility, you did have the slide I saw, and that covered some of the goals of EPR. But here in New York State, we just had I say we as a state, but also my association with Beyond Plastics, were happy that the EPR provisions that were in the state budget this year were removed, because we were trying to do EPR. I say we, but largely it was, I think there was producer input that had very soft provisions for kind of soft or irresponsible provisions that should not be undertaken by the budget. They should be treated through policy and legislation that goes deeper on the subject than a budget provisions could. So we are celebrating that we aren't going to have weak EPR in New York State, and now have a few months in this next session to try and do our own state EPR. But obviously a national EPR standard it's better for everyone, because there's a lot of interstate commerce, and these products are national and global in nature, as are the products and the production and export systems that feed them. So does that help?
Yeah, I mean, for me, definitely, yeah. David knows a lot more on this end than I do.
I know they were afraid of passing that bill, because if once it got in place, nobody was going to work on something better. It would be in place for a while before, and then it would kind of stay there and get in the way of getting something where the producers would be more responsible. Maybe I'm muted again.
No, we can, yeah, no, we can hear you, Joe.
Okay.
What happens to the plastic bags that are collected outside grocery stores or taken back to the dry cleaner? My understanding is they're often turned into things like park benches. Like I don't think they're turned back into new bags. Most things are not turned back into what they were, right? There are a few places. So PET plastic is that number one plastic that you get, like disposable drinking water bottles, like a bottle of Coke, right? That's PET plastic. And then our PET is when it's recycled. And generally, most PET plastic gets turned into polyester and then turned into fleece. Very little of it is turned into rPET, where you could actually make a new water bottle out of it, and or Coke bottle or whatever. Whenever it's available, like Coke and Pepsi just buy it up. They just can't get enough. And so if that could potentially be part of a solution with real recycling, where you're actually replacing that item rather than just turning it into, rather than into just downcycling it into something else. For most, is extended producer responsibility a solution for most of the plastic problems? I certainly think it's a big part of it, right? I think, again, like, because I was looking through some of these other questions are like, well, what can we do, right? Producers need to take responsibility. Like, can we, should we be, trying to be more thoughtful in our own purchases? Sure, but, like I show my students sometimes this, there's this woman who lived in New York City and decided she wanted to live a zero waste life, and then started this blog called Trash is for Tossers, and then gave a TED talk on it. And she doesn't live with, she doesn't produce any waste. It takes a lot of money and time to do that. Like, if you want to go buy all of your stuff without plastic, then you need to have access to a bulk food store, and you need to like be able to buy your own, make your own toothpaste, or go get the stuff that's going to make, the soap or the shampoo. And that takes time. Like, I can't go to Hannaford and get all of those supplies, right? I would have to go to multiple places to do that. And so I forget her name, but what she did is turn it into one of those zero waste stores, right? Where you get the bar shampoo, or you can bring your containers. And that's good, right? Because she recognizes that not everyone has the time to do it themselves. She'll give away all of her recipes for everything she sells. But everything's expensive there, right? Like, if you are on a limited income and you just need shampoo and dish soap and some dinner for your family, like, who has the ability to go into one of those stores? So I think until the manufacturers change the way things are sold, it still is a pretty limited. It's not really a solution if it's not affordable, right? And so if only a few people, only if a small fraction can afford to shop that way or have the time to shop that way, so right, money or the time, then it's not really a solution. And like we can certainly be more thoughtful in the things we buy and bring our own bags when we go grocery shopping. But yeah, I mean, having New York pass the no plastic bag law certainly encouraged a lot more people to be thoughtful in bringing their own grocery bags to the store, right? So I think top-down legislation is really going to help encourage more of these changes. And there's not a perfect solution, because plastic really is good for some things. And if we didn't have plastic, right, like for instance, like I said in the beginning, if we didn't have plastic on food, then there'd be more food waste, and that's a different problem that we're creating. But I do think having that extended producer responsibility and pushing some of that, pushing a lot of that responsibility back onto the manufacturer is going to encourage more change. If they have to deal with their own waste, they're going to figure out a way to make that waste less costly. Either they'll ways that they can reuse it, or they'll be able to come up with a better solution, I think, than a bunch of like putting it on a whole bunch of different individual consumers. Oh yeah, and Louise is putting in a plug for Honest Weight. Any other questions?
Well, we haven't solved the problems yet, but maybe we've gone about as far as we can go for tonight.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's great to see a good turnout. And thank you,
very, very much for
thanks Joe for
coming
organizing this
today.
whole thing.
Yeah, thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne.
Great job. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.